Good morning, everybody. It's really an honor to be here with you and with our distinguished panel. Today, I would like to share with you some of the final reflections of the background paper on policy influence that we developed. So what we really wanted to do is to come up with some ideas on what policy influence is for think tanks in the initiative, and also see how they go about achieving this policy influence. So for this, we were very lucky to be able to collect 12 stories of policy influence from think tanks coming from the different regions where the initiative works. The think tanks wrote the stories themselves and shared them with us. Since we didn't come up with a predefinition of what policy influence is, the stories bring along themselves a variety of interpretations of what policy influence is from the different think tanks. So this is a great opportunity to learn from what we're considering policy influence to be. We also have a very wide range of topics that we're analyzing. We have cases that have focused on education, on poverty reduction, all the way to reframing electoral debates or affirmative action policies in the private sector. So as you can see, we're talking about a wide range of topics that we're influenced on. In this context, we need a framework that would help us analyze the strategies think tanks use in the very diverse context where they are located. So we wanted to have those two issues at hand. So starting with the strategies for policy influence, we focused our analysis on three aspects of policy making or of deciding to do policy influence that we consider crucial. The first is the stage of the policy cycle where influence takes place. The other one is the type of evidence, whether it's more academic in nature or even more action research, and the role think tanks plays, whether it is advising policymakers, advocating for a policy reform, or facilitating dialogue among different stakeholders. But these strategies must be analyzed in each particular context, and with such a diverse group of cases, we needed a way to look at it that would let us organize the cases. So we brought in the work carried out by Robert Hope and his colleagues that try to understand what policy problems are. And so he analyzes two dimensions of a problem. The one is the level of agreement on the norms and values regarding to that topic. And the other one is the certainty on the knowledge that we require to solve that given issue. So I'm going to share with you like a hypothetical example to understand this a little bit more clearly. So let's say a think tank works on health provision, healthcare. And so they're facing a situation where a society, the main stakeholders have already decided that they're going to, healthcare is a right and that it should be debatable whether the solution should be only public or private or a mixture of both, in which case we would be in the darker green scenario where we agree on the end result but not on the solution for it. And then it could also be that we already have a well-established system, but that it is contentious whether health should be a universal provision by the government, in which case we would be in the light green scenario. The unstructured problems are usually much more complex, and for this we could consider the issue of, for example, a peace process, and some of the think tanks here have been working on peace processes after a civil war where there's very little knowledge on the war itself, its implications on the future of a country, and it's very likely there is a contested view on what's the way forward after a war. So that's just a brief example of how to understand this framework. So what we did is we looked at the cases we had and tried to place them in the different categories of problems. So here are the 12 stories placed in all the categories. And what is very clear is that think tanks are better able to influence policy when they work on settings where things are close to an agreement. Societies have come on an agreement on what the end result should be. But it's interesting to know that think tanks do participate in settings that are least structured, and that in these settings, it's very likely that the solution needs not only evidence, but much more beyond that. So it's interesting to note that we found cases in these 12 stories that we can place in all these different scenarios. So with this quick review of the framework we used, I would like to touch upon the main conclusions of the study. So the first one is redefining policy influence. And for these, after seeing the cases, we think that we need to change the answer for two questions. The first question is for what? What are we working on influencing for? And originally, or mostly when we're talking about policy influence, we have focused on the output, on changing a given law or changing a given policy. But with this variety of settings, where there is uncertainty, when there is a lack of agreement, this definition is too narrow, and we need to include things as creating an enabling environment for policy, as changing institutions, as changing power structures that allow a way forward. So this is the first thing that we're looking at policy influence. We really need to look beyond only the outputs. And then the other one is on how. So mostly our discussion on policy influence has been focused on finding out, on saying that policy influence is a set of chores that a researcher carries out to make sure that my research is implemented and taken by a policymaker. So it's seen more of a one-way process, and in this we have prioritized communication strategies and marketing strategies for our ideas. And although this is important, we do see that what is really at the heart of policy influence is the exercise of leadership. And by this, we do not mean that it's pushing for one's own idea, pushing for the idea of one given political party or even of a given donor, but it's actually mobilizing stakeholders to find a joint solution. And this is what think tanks that have shared their stories with us, many of them have done. They have brought up tough questions like discrimination in a society that was not willing to see it. They have had tough conversations among political parties that have been very polarized. So when we're looking at influence, we see that the core is this ability to mobilize people to solve a problem, where leadership is more collective and where think tanks have a very active role participating in the process and not only in giving advice or evidence. From this stems the other thing that think tanks are political actors, even more than they consider themselves to be. And this was striking for me as well, working with a think tank. But it was interesting to see that even in the more structured scenarios, even when policy recommendations were demanded or commissioned by government, think tanks found ways of going beyond that advisory role. And they didn't only bring in their ideas into the table, they were able to create scenarios where new voices were heard, and so they became political actors, bringing others in and not only advising government. In less structured scenarios, think tanks become what Heifetz has defined as leaders without authority. They have placed issues that the government, due to its bureaucracy or due to its following of rules, cannot touch upon. They have brought those topics into the agenda and so have become political actors. What we mean by this at the end is saying that when we give information to different actors that previously didn't have it, or we create spaces where new voices are heard, we change the policy scenario. And that is very crucial in the process of policy influence. And so to finalize, I would like to come back to the title in our paper, which is Influencing as a Learning Process. And we see that think tanks navigate very complex and changing environments, and most of them are very aware of it, and they adjust their strategies accordingly. Sometimes this requires them to advocate for very technical solutions, but sometimes it requires them to start a learning process with society to change their perspectives, to encourage new practices. So influencing is not only a process think tanks are learning how to do, but influence is learning with others on how to find the solution, how to come to terms with that. So those are the main ideas behind the paper so far. We're really looking forward to hearing more of your comments. And thank you all, the institution that share the cases with us and allowed us to do this analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for a very lucid overview. Nancy?